Let's talk about digital identity, the podcast connecting identity and business. I am your host, Oscar Santolaya. Hello and thanks for listening. Today we are going to have a discussion about group of companies, individuals and organizations who are joining forces for solving very important problems today. In particular, we're going to talk about the Decentralized Identity Foundation. And for that, we have a guest who is from one of these members. The guest today is Richard Bird, who is Chief Customer Information Officer at Ping Identity, an internationally recognized data privacy and identity-centric security expert. Richard leverages his diverse experiences as a strategic advisor and solution provider to challenge current notions about cybersecurity and identity. He is a Forbes Tech Council member and has been interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, Business Insider, and the New York Stock Exchange on topics ranging from data protection regulations to cybersecurity-enabled consumer protection. Hello, Richard.
Oscar, how are you?
Very good. It's great having you.
I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Yeah, fantastic. It's great having this conversation. I'm really intrigued to hear more about the Decentralized Identity Foundation. But before that, I would like to hear a little bit about you. So please tell us about yourself and how you joined this world of digital identity.
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting. It's always strange to hear anybody read my bio. I feel like, a bit of imposter syndrome. All this opportunity the last couple of years to talk with all of these different media outlets. And one thing that's interesting, the consistent theme there is it's all business side media outlets. The Journal and CNBC and all those different organizations. And I think a lot of that is because my experience and background has given me the opportunity to be able to translate the complexities, the challenges, the issues in digital identity in a way that the business side of the house can consume and understand. I spent 20 plus years in corporate, and I worked at companies like JP Morgan Chase for many years, Accenture, smaller banks in the Midwest. I also held a chief information officer position and gravitated into information security, also became a chief information security officer. And a large part of that information security timeframe was spent in identity, working it from an operational perspective. And when I left the corporate fold, I spent a couple of years in strategic advising and then joined Ping Identity about 3 years ago. And almost all of my effort and energy has been focused on consumer identities, digital identities, citizen identities, really the space that has proven to be one of our greatest weaknesses and challenges, not just in national cybersecurity infrastructure for things like election and healthcare and vaccinations and all of that, but it's also been an extremely problematic area in terms of creating a much bigger digital divide where people, human beings don't have the ability to exercise their rights to prove that they are who they say they are in the digital the way that they do in the analog. So I went from a long time of being a corporate resource that really didn't care about those subjects because my job was to protect my company. I always like to say I wore the soccer or football jersey of the company that I worked for. But as I left those industries and saw really the disparities and the challenges that we're facing because we don't have a notion of decentralized identity, we don't have a notion of true digital identity, we just continue to have accounts and passwords. We just really, saw an opportunity with the Decentralized Identity Federation or Foundation rather, as well as other organizations to help create a framework for a world where digital identity isn't just a thing, but it's operationalized. It has interoperability. It can be recognized, most importantly, so that people, human beings, can be empowered to have some part to play in identifying themselves in the digital world. So that's kind of how did you get here? But that really, my background is just lots and lots of years of getting identity hopefully more right than wrong over the course of my time in doing it and learning a lot about identity along the way.
Yeah, excellent. And many things that you have said resonate with me. For instance, bringing the complexity of identity problems, concepts, and approaches to outside people who are not technical. So bringing to the business decision makers is very important. It's very important not only for the ones who bring the solutions, but for the ones who are the ones who need the solutions. So a lot of your work, as you said, came from corporate, helping corporate the problem now. Sounds like you're focusing more into the consumer citizen, right? And as you have mentioned now already, decentralized identity. Please explain us in a simple way, as I'm sure you know very well. What is that and what are the top challenges?
Yeah. Decentralized identity is kind of interesting because we have historical precedences for it in the analog, in the real world, where pieces of our identity are distributed across, you can call it an ecosystem or, different locations, right? So in the analog, we had to bring together those pieces, say a physical passport, and the trusted authority for that is, in the United States is the State Department, and a driver's license. And maybe if we were signing up for a new service, had to get something, maybe we had to show up with some information about our current residence, a utility bill that had our current address on it. That's a very interesting analog or analogy to compare to digital identity, because we know in the analog world that process of bringing all those pieces of information together from these different sources to confirm that we are who we say we are is really frustrating. So when we look at the digital space, when we look at decentralized identity, it's somewhat the same notion, but it becomes an architecture that is relying on trust providers or a trusted layer to bring those different component pieces of information together to create a confirmation of identity. So I like to think of all the digital capabilities that we have today. Maybe it's device trust, and you have information about your handset, you have information about your physical address, you have information about, the different trustable pieces, and you bring that together so that we can actually prove that you are who you say you are. Here's the thing that's really fascinating about decentralized identity. It creates a framework that is extremely difficult to spoof or to commit fraud, because no single source has all of the information. And I think that's the most important piece here, because the ability for the bad guys to take advantage of identity, which, organizations like Gartner and the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report have for years called out the fact that identity is the single largest contributor to exploits and breaches. The ability for them to be able to steal an identity has been way too easy in the digital world. And it's mainly because all that information is housed in one location, one database, and this notion of decentralization creates a framework where you have to put all the pieces together to be able to steal somebody's identity. And this notion of trust and credibility and assurance is really what, creates a model for me. And I'll leave off with this, for me to be able to have a part to play in my identity in the digital world, and be able to choose who I share that information with and when, which is not possible in most cases today. In most cases today, those decisions are made for me as a consumer, or a citizen, or an employee, and decentralized identity will create an empowerment framework for people to have a part to play in their digital identity.
Mm-hmm. And why is it important for individuals to have control over their own identities?
See, I kind of led right into the next question. This is what I've personally become passionate about. And I'm excited. We'll get to what the Decentralized Identity Foundation is, but I'm always excited how standards organizations get established, because it tends to be the thinkers, the architects, the people that understand that you have to have a great design before you build the house. And that's very much the case with the Decentralized Identity Foundation. But when we think about what they're collectively, and we collectively are trying to do, they're trying to create a world where digital identity means something, right? Today, like, you think about your own experience, Oscar. You have On average, you have something like 137, I think is the number I remember, accounts or interfaces with e-commerce providers, healthcare providers, your whole digital experience. Every one of those digital experiences, you are a different identity. You're 137 different identities. You don't have a core identity that you have some control over, which makes it virtually impossible to do things like delegate my rights and privileges to, say, a family member in the healthcare space, because, the healthcare space, I've got another 30 accounts. And maybe I need to delegate my care to somebody because I can't take care of myself. But I don't have the ability to do that in an elegant way. The real reason that controlling our own identities is important is because for 30 years in the digital space, at least, we've had no control. And we know what the consequences are. I work with an organization in San Diego, the Identity Theft Resource Center. And when you see the numbers of how many cases of identity theft and fraud are committed every year against individual human beings, the impact is getting to the point where we can no longer just shrug it off. We can no longer just say it's a victimless crime. I've seen situations where people have, there's a great story from my own podcast that was shared with me by the director, where she said that somebody had stolen a young woman's identity while she was a minor. Synthetic fraud, a very common practice now amongst the bad guys. First child to ever have the opportunity to go to college in her family. And then when she went to go apply for college, she couldn't get everything covered with scholarships, so she needed a loan. And when she went to go apply for a loan, she found out that her entire credit history was destroyed and she was not 18 years old yet. It took her 3 years. She was forced to fix that problem herself. It took her 3 years to finally get to a point where her credit was made whole again. And in that 3 years, she couldn't go to college. So she wasn't with her cohort anymore. She lost 3 earning years. So the damage that's happening to people because of the inability to have control over some aspect of their digital identity is real. It's tangible. It's painful. And frankly, I think for the most part, we're no longer, as people, weary about it. We're angry, right? We're tired of not being able to have a say in our digital lives and having, the consequences of these breaches and exploits land on top of us personally. So it all begins with identity, right? This is why we want to create a world where people have some control over their own identity.
Yes, well, that example you told me, that it's hard to imagine actually for me. Yeah, that were cases that person had to lose 3 years to recover her identity. Yeah, I can understand with cases like that, especially the magnitude of this problem. So please tell us about a bit more about the Decentralized Identity Foundation.
As I mentioned, I always enjoy seeing the rise of standards bodies, and the Decentralized Identity Foundation is definitely in the young stage and age of its growth. We at Ping Identity have been founders and participants in every single identity standard since the company was founded. And in many cases, we've actually been the originators, right? The original founders of those standards. In the case of Decentralized Identity Foundation, though, we connected because we have a vision of a world where decentralized identity becomes the standard method for identity authentication authorization. And our interest in the Decentralized Identity Foundation definitely was driven by our own experiences on the development of the Colorado Digital Driver's License. It is a decentralized form of identification. We worked closely with another company and the state of Colorado. And those 3 companies, ourselves, and then ID Data Web, and then the state of Colorado, represent different stores of information about this digital driver's license. And I'm able to manifest that application, that driver's license, on my phone. It took about a year before the Colorado State Police would even, agree to acknowledge the digital driver's license as a valid form of identification. Not because there's anything wrong with the Colorado State Police, but because all of their processes were built around the use of a plastic physical driver's license. This is where, the Decentralized Identity Foundation is doing these beginning component pieces of architecture and framework necessary for us to have a strong amount of assurance and trust that a decentralized identity, when it's manifested, is who they say they are, and that resource or that digital identity, that decentralized identity, has access to the resources and assets that it should, nothing more, nothing less. And this whole basis of trust is really what I see when I look at the charter for the Decentralized Identity Foundation. When I look at the frameworks and the technical documents that they're publishing, they're building a very, very thorough model, all of the different component pieces that are necessary to achieve that magic word, to achieve trust in a digital identity. They're doing so in a way where, the expectation is that the source information that is brought together to establish that confirmed digital identity is coming from multiple sources that are, again, trusted at their root, but are able to be brought together in such a way that they can be, we can be confident as a reliant party, as somebody who needs to be able to trust that final credential, being brought together in such a way that it's extremely difficult to hack, break, crack, and it's also very difficult to simply duplicate. And now we get to this level of assurance that is so lacking in the digital world. Like I said, it is a heavily engineering-focused effort in the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and I think that that's extremely important because in this case, the standards need to be really precise and frankly, probably prescriptive in order to be able to achieve the degree of trust necessary for interoperability. And I'll just say that's really the biggest problem. All things are easy until we get to operationalization. And once we get to operationalization, it's where we find our biggest challenges. Concept is good, architecture is great, operationalization is challenging.
And yeah, I understand the interoperability problems. I've been in some other organization about standards, and we feel that we follow the same paradigm, but at the end of the trying the solutions together is like, oops, but actually my architecture is different. So my conception of this concept is this, but let's put the pieces together, not so ready. So I understand, of course, the challenges. And about that, tell us a bit about the type of organizations that are working already there, and also how much has been you got members from, let's say, different type of organizations, public software vendors and private and NGOs, and also by countries. Tell me a bit, how is that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's really a very diverse landscape for a frontier that is relatively new. 3 years ago, I can remember I went to a number of different sessions at Identiverse that were focused on self-sovereign identity, digital identity, and decentralized identity. And there were, when we look at the enterprise solution space, where companies like Ping Identity reside, there was this operationalization problem. So we go, oh man, like blockchain for identity, that's really, really cool. How do we figure out how to incorporate it into an enterprise-grade solution? Because blockchain for identity or decentralized identity in isolation, the overall framework is so new, the ability to actually move it into production is challenging, right? You have to find the use cases, you have to find the pieces and components where the buying public on the solution side is willing to absorb that tech. They're willing to change their business processes, and they're willing to adopt these new standards. That takes a lot of time. So 3 years ago, a lot of what we're talking about in this discussion, and a lot of what the Decentralized Identity Foundation was, frankly, probably not yet even quite dreaming about, was considered to be whiteboard focused. But in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge shift So this notion of digital identity, and some organizations and nations are attacking it from a decentralized standpoint, some are not, but they're all pursuing a goal of a digital identity, which is, I need to be real precise about that, because we're already in a space over the last couple of years where there's arguments about terminology. Digital identity is really this notion of creating a digital version of the analog you. Mm-hmm. So digital identity is not an accumulation, a summation, a federation of all of your accounts and passwords. It's this rich representation of an aggregation of data that is out there about all of us. Now that opens up for another conversation that you and I can have, Oscar, one day. That opens up, concerns about how much of this point information about my location, about velocity, about what network I'm running on, all these different pieces, how much of that has to be aggregated before we start to go over the line relative to privacy concerns and security concerns. We're just all exploring that space now, and that's a big piece of that interoperability challenge. But the companies and nations that are coming together are attacking the problem in much the same way, which is create a digital identity that can be highly trusted. So in Australia, we see a tremendous amount of work in this space. In the EU, we see that the Digital Marketplace Initiative, which is what created GDPR, it created Open Banking PSD2. We're seeing the beginnings of the last stage of that, which is the mandate for creating a digital identity for the citizens of the EU. So the Nordics have actually created a model for, they call it the Bank ID. They've created a digital identity that has been well received and well adopted by the population within the Nordics. So we're seeing, lots of this. And we see like social media company, we see Facebook that's like, we're going to create a digital identity standard because, that's part of our cryptocurrency focus, right? So we're seeing a world where digital identity was barely a topic a couple of years ago to now it is a huge topic. And companies around the world like Ping Identity, as well as, organizations like the Better Identity Coalition in Washington, D.C., who are pushing legislators here in the United States to acknowledge the importance of digital identity for cybersecurity infrastructure, have really expanded the conversation. The big thing is that brings us back to the decentralized identity notion. One of the most common patterns that we're seeing is that a drive to put, the term most frequently used is a digital identity wallet, but the drive to put some of the key components of identity into a user's hands in the tech that they use, which is going beyond, mobile handsets now, right? I'd like to point out that my fitness watch actually is more powerful than my cell phone was 3 years ago. Whether it be home automation devices, tablets, all these pieces are now available to us to give a human being the power to have that core piece of their identity. And the decentralized identity capability then aggregates the information that's necessary to establish the digital identity in the moment that is needed for the persona or relationship that I have in that transaction, right? So I don't show up with a social media digital identity to do my banking, right? Because my bank is not going to acknowledge login with social media, right? It's too risky. I would say that, there are multiple different parts of society and the business world that are focused on digital identity and the notion of decentralized identity. This is why it's so important to have an organization like the Decentralized Identity Foundation, because we have a lot of people that are attacking this problem with a lot of great thinking, but a lot of different approaches. And when we get to a point where digital identity is a necessity for us to be able to do business in the digital as well as the physical world, if there's not reconciliation of those efforts and tying those efforts to a set of standards, we will have a lot of difficulty. We'll have cross-border difficulties. We'll have, business entity difficulties, because we'll find that organizations and nations are arguing about whether they'll acknowledge that digital identity. Again, really emphasizing the importance of the standards focus that the Decentralized Identity Foundation is working from.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more that it's so important to make sure that all these efforts, that some of them, of course, have started from different motivations, but are toward the same goal to join together, join forces together. I understand that a big part of the work that the standardizations or like foundation, the Decentralized Identity Foundation is creating a standard. That's one big part of the goal. It's pretty clear. Let's say I would like to hear now how the foundation is already helping some use cases, some people, communities. If you give some examples, because I would guess that there are already products that are tackling specific use cases.
Yeah, it's been really cool to, in my case, I actually use the source materials that are available at the Decentralized Identity Foundation's website to really kind of keep up with everything that's going on. I think that in the services space currently that are, giving companies the beginning pieces to consider how they can incorporate decentralized identity into their own application base as well as their own processes. There's a universal resolver that the Digital Identity Foundation has brought to the table in two parts. They have a focus on, for the lack of a better term, a sandbox, so that you can see how these pieces come together, and you're looking at interoperability across ledgers and digital identity methods, so that you can see how those start to work. I'm actually looking at the blog post right now that was put up by Marco Sabadello last year about how this universal resolver is currently presented to the marketplace, saying, hey, here's an opportunity for you to use a foundational piece, but we're in early days. So, this is not intended to be used for your production use cases, but it is definitely a set of tools for you to be able to test your use cases. The universal resolver is in two viable pieces, an experimental piece and a stable piece. One that's oriented towards, IBM Cloud, the other to AWS. And it's giving people, I think this is the most important part of, these types of resources to the market. It's giving organizations, it's giving technologists the ability to see how these components can work, basically on a subject that, kind of go back to what I said earlier, basically on a subject that really didn't exist from a technical execution standpoint 3 years ago, barely even 2 years ago. And, so one of the things that we've got to provide as a tool set to, this population of interested parties in decentralized identity is a method to be able to take it from, this level of abstraction, this conceptual level, and to get hands dirty a bit, right? Dig into the soil and see how these components work. I actually think when we talk about how the Decentralized Identity Foundation is enabling or empowering businesses today, I think this is the most important service that they can be providing to the market, because we all know that the biggest challenge that we face in identity and in many solution spaces as well is the instant that one of these identity terms, one of these technology terms becomes a marketing banner, we see a tremendous amount of business side interest and expectation. I'll use Zero Trust as a great example. Zero Trust is a methodology, but because of the way that marketing has taken over, seized the Zero Trust message, we have a large contingent of business leaders that think now, Zero Trust is a solution, and I just need to go buy it and I can have Zero Trust. This foundational work is important because once decentralized identity becomes a much bigger part of the conversation, we have to have equipped people with knowledge, information, and standards to be able to be successful in the execution of it. Because once it becomes the term of the day, our business colleagues will be super interested in executing. If we're still talking at the conceptual level, we will struggle to meet the need to solve those business problems. So I think that's, when I think about how, businesses and organizations are currently being empowered by the Decentralized Identity Foundation, it is the body of work that they've developed, which is extensive. And I highly recommend for folks that have that type of technical interest, go to the website, and then also this ability for companies to see how it can actually work in a real setting as opposed to conceptual diagrams. I think that's really the value that they're providing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent to know. There's among all the great job we are doing in the foundation, there's already for, as you said, for the ones who wants to get their hands dirty. Well, there's this sandbox and ready to play around. Fantastic. We are leading the end of this very interesting conversation with you, Richard. But I'd like to ask you, final question for all the business leaders listening to this. What is the one actionable idea that they should write on their agenda now?
Well, I think that the actionable idea begins with a truth, right? And we have to acknowledge that much of our concerns about the future tend to be driven by assumptions or presumptions that we make about what we think it's going to look like. The difference here is that digital identity is already a thing. That's the truth, right? So for business leaders, when I'm talking to organizations that are still struggling with, say, the basic fundamentals of identity, and you start talking about digital identity, the initial reaction is, oh my gosh, you're talking, I'm in a Fred Flintstone world and you're talking about Star Trek. And the problem is that that causes us to resist change, right? We're stuck with our legacy debt of not just technology, but processes. And we go, oh, I can't talk about, something so advanced. It's already here, right? I always like to use the example of Apple in that case, right? Apple is building a digital identity ecosystem. Now it's dependent upon Apple devices and the Apple universe. But the truth is that they've come out and said, if you use our products, you'll have more privacy, more safety as an individual. They're making a digital identity statement, right? So the importance there is that for businesses is that Apple made a competitive differentiation statement based on security and privacy, tied explicitly to a strong identity model for the consumer. That's going to drive change way faster than any compliance or regulation demand. And that's the real message here is to business leaders is this isn't future speak. This is not a utopian state. This is here. And it's really important to consider how you're going to absorb, incorporate, and work in a world where digital identity and decentralized identity are a key component of the overall structure and how you service customers, how you work with your employees. The great news is that business leaders, last nugget that I'll leave you with, don't be afraid, right? The changes that can come from this, everything from operational efficiency and improvements to a reduction in loss reserves. There's so many different pieces to this because identity in the digital world has been broken for so long. There's so many different pieces of this that will improve embracing this change and also being a leader to drive, the business process change that's necessary. Technology only fixes part of the problem. You have to change your processes to maximize and optimize that technology solution. Embracing that change as leaders is really going to change the world in the digital space. And that would be the most important thing I think that business leaders need to hear. Help is on the way. Cool things are happening. The ability to create differentiated, customer experiences, the ability to create secure customer experiences is right here. And it's being driven by decentralized identity and digital identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Thanks a lot, Richard, for this interview. Please let us know how people would like to find more about the Decentralized Identity Foundation and also they would like to get in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. The Decentralized Identity Foundation is out there in the webosphere. I definitely encourage people to go to the link. I am pulling it up right now. Identity Foundation, HTTPS identityfoundation. Take you right to the Digital Identity Foundation. I mentioned some other resources. If you really are eager to understand the challenges within identity, the Identity Theft Resource Center is certainly one. The Better Identity Coalition is certainly another. And if we dimension the size and scale of the business problems that we're facing, it can do nothing but motivate us even more to pursue knowledge that we can get from the Digital Identity Foundation, the Decentralized Identity Foundation, to hopefully make progress much quicker in fixing the digital world.
Yes, excellent. Again, thanks a lot, Richard. It was a pleasure talking with you, and all the best.
Oscar, thank you for having me on. I truly appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk About Digital Identity, produced by UbiSecure. Stay up to date with episodes at ubisecure.com/podcast, or join us on Twitter at ubisecure and use the hashtag LTADI. Until next time,